All right, I'll go ahead and begin. My name is Librande. I'm the creative director at EA Maxis, and I've been working in the game industry for over 10 years now. And during that time, I've written literally hundreds of design documents of all sorts of different types, all the way from small-scale web applications, all the way up to huge, like multi-million-dollar PC and console titles. So I've covered a pretty wide spectrum of design during that time. And a lot of the designs that I've written, some are to be read by executives or programmers or artists of the marketing department. And no matter what, I found that there's one type of design document that clearly does a better job than any other type, and that's the one-page design document. So I'm going to go over, talk about some of those, and show you some examples. First, I wanted to start out and talk a little bit about standard design documentation. And this is the stuff that you might see in your office already. Just wanted to talk about the pros and cons of those and give you some context about the one-page designs. Then we'll talk more about the one-page design documents. That's the majority of the talk. And that's mostly just me showing some examples of designs that I've worked on over time. I kind of want you to leave this session with the encouragement or the enthusiasm to create your own design documents, one-page designs, when you get back to your own shops. Raise your hands if you're designers and you actually write design documents. Good, perfect audience for this talk. So hopefully you'll learn a few tips and tricks along the way and things that you can try out. And then just kind of summarize at the end, talking about some of the benefits, and end it up there. So I wanted to start out talking about design Bibles. And who's ever read a design Bible cover to cover? Okay, so, and most of you have probably been in the industry for a while because those are kind of the dinosaurs now. So a design Bible is usually printed. It could be easily 100 or more pages. And mostly heavy text-based type of document. You print it out, you bind it up, and then you hand it out to the team. And that's kind of the Bible. It's a very authoritative source of all the information in the game. Usually if you're going to write one of these things, you would start out with a template or an outline in Word. And back in the 90s when I first started coming to GDC, there was actually talks about, here's my template that I use. And Chris Taylor actually still have his outline that he had, that he presented one year. And so these are like basically a checklist. If I get this document, I go into Word and I fill out every single thing on this chart, then I'm done with the design. Like, what else is there to do? This is every possible thing that can happen in a video game. And so therefore, if I completely filled in the whole thing, I can just print it out, hand it out, and then just go home. Because now I just have to wait for those people to build the thing that I wrote up. And there's actually, it seems, I'm being slightly sarcastic there, but there's actually some companies, people I've talked to, that said, programmers, like, I never even saw our designers. They sit on another floor. I see their design documents, but I never see them. I never get to talk to them. It's a very one-way flow. That's back in the 90s, and that company is no longer in business. But I'm sure there's still companies who use this approach to creating design documentation. Here's one of the very first ones I wrote. This is like in 1997, a game called Creature Ball at a small startup company I was at. And this is a little web-based game. And here's the first page. And as you can see, this is pretty much what most pages of design Bibles look like. Just big masses of text, page after page after page. And they're really thorough if you actually bother to read it. Huge amounts of information are contained in this, but really daunting. So, you throw in a few illustrations, you try to make it compelling. But if you kind of look at what's going on up here, there's like every icon, every sound effect, all the different UI options, what a right-click menu does, how the game design part, and so on. It just breaks it all down, the physics, sound effects, artwork requirements, time estimates, and so on. And this is a pretty small proposal, too. So you can kind of like see where this can go. Now, if you start making bigger ones, I started searching around and I found Leisure Suit Larry's Casino online. So I downloaded this from 1997 also. This is, again, the kind of standard back in the 90s of how to do design documents. Same thing, big table of contents. This one's about 30 pages long. First page, huge, massive text again. This one, the women that you're going to meet along the way. And some interface stuff. I like this little stuff chart up here. I don't know if you can read it, but it says different things you can buy, like roses, condoms, and disinfectant, which are like the 3 things you need for a perfect date in Leisure Suit Larry. The Grim Fandango document, Double Fine, Tim Schafer released this up on their website a while back. And since it's been taken down, but like anything on the internet, once it goes up, it never comes back down really. This one was really cool because it wasn't a Word document, it was a PDF. It was scanned, all the pages, so you actually see like notes and stuff scribbled on the document, which gives it this really like authentic, like this dusty tome, this Bible of information. And this one's about 70 pages long, and it's a really great read. If you can find it, I recommend like trying to track it down and read through it. The last page here, the cutscene, the final farewell, and has this little, probably Tim Schafer, I'm sure, did something like this. But there's this kind of feeling like when you finally get through one of these, as the author, like you do just want to cry. Like, this is it, I've done it. I finally finished this thing, and now I can just go home and please execute it like this, and everybody's going to be happy. So the pros, like I've been saying, it's the definitive source of all the information about the game. It's incredibly thorough. Everything's in one place. It's in this book. You can actually hand it to somebody. They can take it home with them. They don't need to be plugged into a computer to read it. And the most important thing for me as a designer, I still use this approach, actually. I just don't show anybody my documents anymore. I just keep them to myself. Because this is, as a design process, it's the best process you can possibly use. Because the act of writing that document is the act of designing. A lot of people, I'm a designer, I have these ideas in my head, but as soon as you sit down and have to write that sentence out that describes that, you realize it's like, oh wait, should I write this or that? And that moment, that little flash of insight where you're like, man, I have to commit right now. And sometimes I'm just sitting there for like 15 minutes just thinking in my head what that sentence should be. It's a very slow, it can be very painful writing style, but you're guaranteed to know the stuff inside and out when you're done. Cons, of course, it just doesn't scale up. Most of these documents were in the 90s. Well, we were still shipping games on floppy disks, back then. Teams were much smaller. As teams get bigger and bigger and projects get bigger, you just can't do this anymore. If you had to update the document, let's say I want to change one sentence. Like, how am I going to do that? I've already printed 20 copies. I've handed it out. I'm going to go through and unbind them all and change this paper and just put in this one sentence. And how is everybody going to know I did that? And it's printed, so it's difficult to search. And even if you have the Word document of it, then it's still kind of a pain to search through. So, of course, we've moved on from those, and now we're in the era of the design wiki. And raise your hand if, as a designer, you work on a design wiki. Okay, so most of you do these days. When I went over, when I left Blizzard and I went over to EA, it was like this huge difference, because when I was at Blizzard at the time, we were actually trying to get a wiki. I see Wyatt here. We were like we want a wiki, and it was like a little pressure against that. But over at EA, it was just, you don't see any printed stuff. Everything's on the wiki. So in its simplest form, a design wiki is really just the same thing. Like, you have this big template, and you fill it out. It's just the process is a little different. You double-click, and then you type in your stuff, and then you hit enter, and then that section is filled out. So this is from the Spore Hero Arena, and it's just this basically just as dry as anything else, but it follows a very similar format. This is from the Spore front page, and it's kind of nice and attractive, but it just was a no man's land underneath each of those links. So any team who each had their own links there for the different games in Spore could really just do anything they wanted. There wasn't a lot of control over the process, and therefore it just kind of gets to be a little tangled mess of spaghetti after a while, and you can't find stuff, and it's like, I know I put that up there, but I can't remember, did I ever link to it? Where is it? This one, when I worked on the Simpsons project at EA, this was like undoubtedly the best wiki that I've ever worked on. And the reason why is we had a producer, Hans Tenkate, and his job was to manage the wiki. His full-time, you're the producer, you're in charge of the wiki. And he took it very seriously. He made sure everybody followed the rules and did what they were supposed to do, and things went in the right place, and it got updated. He made this cool mind map so you could see the whole, this is the game design document. This was our Bible, just all online. It makes it really easy. So, I would have a link, and I would click on it, and, I'm working on Marge's mini games or whatever, and I could put in illustrations, I could do all this stuff. Pros, easy access, easy to update, just double-click, type away. Everything's kind of in its own little compartments. You get the whole team can work on it. It's not just one person doing it. Anybody can click on it. And because of that, it's great to have history and tracking so that you know who made those changes and when they made them. Problem, like I said, it requires constant maintenance. And a more subtle problem is it starts to hide design relationships. And I'll talk more about this, as you'll see in some of the one-page designs. But because everything is chunked up, it's hard to get a sense of how it all fits together into one whole. You can look at, say, that front page and get a sense of, oh, here's the index, but it doesn't really show you the relationships between all those parts. And this is low resolution. You're going to see this over and over again as I give this talk. I'm trying to take 300, 600 dot per inch images that I print out and put them up on this screen. Yeah, it's a huge screen, but the DPI is just terrible, 72 DPI here and up here. So you just lose a lot that a printer is just much better at. And the other thing is the viewport limitation, which is you're constantly as a designer, I'm forced to fit everything into this arbitrarily small rectangle. What if my design is long and wide? No one wants to scroll across to see it. What if it happens to be this way? I got to scroll. What if it's both ways? And got to zoom in and out. It's just really a pain to get the information up there. And I think it's really constraining to designs to force yourself to everything has to be viewed through this glass window in front of your audience. All right. So a bigger problem of both of those is that as a designer, you hear this all the time. Well, I write all this documentation, but nobody ever reads it. And it's true. No one ever really reads much of anything anymore. You can, whether it's printed, whether it's on a computer screen on a wiki, you're emailing it to somebody, I'll read that later. They look at the scroll bar. There's actually been some eye tracking studies recently where they say people look at the headlines and the pictures and then they look at the scroll bar, and if it's too big, then they exit the web page. Say, I don't want to scroll, man. But if it's short, then they'll stick around. Same thing with when you send people email and they look at wikis and stuff like that. The exact same thing happens. I'll get to it later, but then it scrolls off the email list and then it's gone. So, of course, the solution and what this talk is about is only use one page. And that's what we'll talk about. So some inspirations first before I show the actual documentation. When I was younger, I wanted to be an architect, and so I took a lot of drafting classes, architectural classes, and I really love this style. Here we have an architectural view. If I'm the client, if I'm going to live in the building, I want to see the elevation. That plan there that's kind of mysterious to me. I kind of understand what it is, but there's a lot of information that I don't need. If I'm a contractor, I don't even want to see the elevation view. It's kind of meaningless to me. I don't care where the trees are going to be planted, but I need to know the spacing between the 2x4s and the walls and things like that. So you can get a lot of information on one page, and you can focus it towards different audiences really easily. Of course, we've all played with Legos, and you've got to really appreciate their design documentation. No words. 5 years old kids can follow this stuff easily, even younger. This kind of stuff, for me, this is it's kind of sad. It tells a lot about me, but I get emotional looking at drawings like this. It's so beautiful. Look at that. Imagine if I had to say, I'm going to make the wiki page of the wiki design document of this. It'd be a whole bunch of chunks, the intercooler, the vertical cooling fins, and you wouldn't really see that relationship between all of those things. But these kind of, the craftsmanship and the information that's contained in just this one page is just incredible. Kids placemats, another great inspiration for those of you who have kids. You go to the store and you buy these plastic placemats, or maybe you remember them when you were a kid, filled with information. They're colorful, they're fun. You want to look at them while you're eating. You move your food aside so you can look at what's going on, and then you spill it all on the table, which is the whole, the opposite point of having a placemat in the first place. But if the job is done right, it's placemats are always one-page design documents. And I've seen a bunch of them, dinosaurs, and then they have the states, United States of America, with funny little icons and bears in Yosemite and things like that. This one, raise your hand if you've seen this chart. This is a very famous chart. Okay, so a few of you have. This is a graph that shows Napoleon's march into Moscow, and the width of the line is the size of his army. The tan line is him going out, and the black line is him coming back. So, very powerful, lots of information. The temperatures down there on the bottom, the dates, where they cross rivers. So the information contained in this diagram is just really incredible. And it's also making a very powerful statement. If I were to tell you what I just told you any other way, it might not have the impact about what really went on when he sent out his troops and how they came back again. So those are all examples that have inspired me to start working on my own one-page designs. It's hey, here's, it can be done. It clearly can be done. So let's try to do this in our game design too. So I started out when I was working at Blizzard. I was working at Blizzard North on the Diablo 3 project. And I was doing some UI design as well. And a lot of UI design, if you've done that, it's flowcharts. And so this is an example of a flowchart that I made, and kind of all fits on one page. I had to use a legal-size paper to get it all to fit. Again, you're kind of seeing the limitations of what I can do on the screen here. But what I noticed is that one of the programmers had this hanging up in his office and on the wall, and he wasn't even working on that particular part. I'm like, why do you have that up on their wall? He's like, oh, I thought it looked cool. And I'm like, wait, I write all these other documents, these big, fat documents that have information that you really need to read, and it's just sitting on your desk in a pile. why don't you hang that up on the wall? Well, you can't hang a book up on the wall, but it inspired me. It's like, could I start making my design documents so that people would want to hang them on their wall? Because as a designer, your goal is to communicate information to your audience. And if they're hanging it up on the wall, like, gee, you're getting through to them. They're actually paying attention to what you have to say. And other people who come in their office are seeing it too and asking for copies. Well, that's a huge win. So we started working on a game we called D-Hack, and it was basically Diablo combined with the Rogue hack-style game, just to test our 3D engine. It was an early prototype. So like, instead of documenting and writing all this text, I'm just going to draw a picture of what it should look like. There's a little town, a little cave. You go in the cave, and it just goes down like 100 levels, and that's basically it. And it's more of a prototype test of our tools and stuff than an actual game, although it was kind of a fun game too. So I made this little document, and then we'd go into meetings and we'd talk about it. It's like, let's add this, let's add that. And so over time, it started to like expand out, and I would add these little modules and then just increase it. And you'll notice there's like a lot of notes and stuff written, scribbled on this, because I would take these into meetings and actually like write on them and get information, take them back and make the changes, then print out a new one. And so now, so don't blink. I'm going to go ahead 2 years in the future. So instead of going through step by step, there you go. So that's how it ended up when I left, like 2 years later. This is the entirety of Act 1. And I know you can't really see it, and I'm going to blame monitors again and low DPI. But when this is printed out on tabloid-sized paper. So I started learning a trick. It's like, hey, paper comes in all sorts of sizes. I can make one-page design documents. I just got to keep using bigger and bigger paper. And it is kind of a trick, but it's also like, why not? Like, if you got the printer, you got the paper, like, use this stuff. So if I zoom in a little bit on this, you can see it's not a level design document in the sense that I'm going to give it to a level designer to implement this. It's a high-level view of the entire game in a way that you can't really see in any other way. While you're playing the game, you never experience this way. But it has like every waypoint, every monster, its model name, its AI, whether it's melee, whether it's like poison or electricity, what level we expect the player to be, how far into the game they should be at this time. So it's almost like, I like to think of it as like almost like a musical score. Like it shows me the whole flow of the entire game. And then we can just test, when people play the game, it's like, oh, you should be level 13 when you get to Winterstone, are you? Yes, no? Okay, we're doing good. Actually, speaking of the Winterstone there, that little town, so eventually it's like it becomes its own document, and still pushing the limits of this. Like, what can I do on one page? How much information can I cram in? When will it just like explode? When will people's head explode? When will I break Adobe Illustrator once and for all? And so I've just started cramming all this stuff in there, but still trying to make it like, hey, I want to read this. I wish this was a placemat that I could put my food on every day. So those they're kind of based on physical things, the levels, movement around in Diablo. So I started wondering, it's like, well, what about combat? Could you do an abstract system using these one-page design documents? And this one here, this is concept art. This isn't a one-page document because it doesn't really speak to the design of the game, but it definitely speaks to the feeling of the game, even though this never actually would ever happen. But I bring it up because this is when you say combat in Diablo, it's like, yeah, look at that. This is combat in Diablo, but in my mind, combat in Diablo, sadly, looks like this. So this is what I sometimes call the football documents, and they're like X's and O's, and the player's an O, and the monsters are X's. And when you really look at Diablo and you break it down into a purely 2D mouse-clicking exercise, which arguably, that's what it is, you have to try to say, like, how many different ways can we get the player to click their mouse on a 2D plane and still keep their interest? And so what variables can I play with? How fast they click, how long they hold down, how fast they're moving their mouse back and forth, and so on. And so this little chart was like, well, this is pretty much everything you can do in Diablo at the very, like, atomic level. And it kind of shows all these relationships. Now, the fun part is you take all these atoms of combat, and then you start combining them up into higher and higher level spells and abilities where they all start to hook together, and you get all these combinations between the two. And so we would make a single page for each one of the skills that we were working on. And also just a quick disclaimer, I don't work at Blizzard anymore, and I'm not working on Diablo 3, so hopefully, there's nothing that I'm hopefully giving away. Wyatt's smiling at me. All right, because he still works there. So a little quick switch over from the blood and violence and demons over to the happy, colorful land of Springfield. When I left Blizzard North and went over to EA, my first project was working on Springfield. And I go, you'll be the lead level designer on the Springfield. Like, this is so easy. All I have to do is watch Simpsons episodes all day and just copy what they did in the show. Well, unfortunately, this was the best drawing that I could find of what Springfield looks like according to the show, which is not too helpful for a level designer. But, we run with it. So I grabbed a bunch of cardboard boxes, and we took over the table in the middle of the design pit and little sticky notes, and we're just like, okay, let's figure out, let's play with some things. And in my mind, this is a one-page design document. Yeah, I'm not printing it out, but it's still like one page. Everything is there in front of people, and plus it's in a very prominent spot of the office. You couldn't get in or out of your cube without walking around this table. And so it became this very central kind of like war room approach almost to like, okay, let's gather around the Springfield and let's like try to assemble this beast and figure out where everything's going to be. And over time we started decorating it and, like kind of making it a little nicer and better and figuring out where all the little stickies need to go. And we eventually kind of came up with this diagram. This is a very high level chart of how the different elements hook together. And I kind of could have ended it like right there because we had done some of the work, but we started after we took the cardboard off the table. I'm like, I'm kind of missing that. And plus, EA has these awesome plotters, really big, wide plotters. So you can just print these huge posters. And like I said, well, hey, I'm going to like use as much paper as I can and see how far I can push on this one-page design document idea. So I started printing out these big maps, and then eventually I started cutting out little 2D, little build art, 2D stand-ups so that we could make it a little more 3D. And eventually we came up. This was when I left the project. This was the final version of Springfield. It's really hard to like show you again because of the resolution. So I'll see if I can switch into Illustrator here and show you in just a second. But I was also, again, I could have just stopped right here on this thing, but I had also done about 25 interiors, and each of these was its own one-page design document that I would give to a level designer where they would go through and they'd say like, oh, we need fries and a burger shelf and Buzz Cola for a Krusty Burger, so we need to contact our outsourcing company and make sure those are all on the list, and whether this thing has physics and whether it's edible and so on. So did tons of these. So I had them all there, and I'm like, I'm not filling up the paper enough. I have more table space. So I tried to stick every single one of those buildings onto that main drawing. Just had this huge poster. I wanted to bring it in. It's just like too unwieldy to carry around with me. So let's see if I can do the next best thing. This is kind of a bit of an experiment here. So this is the actual Illustrator document that we're looking at right now. And so if I zoom down in here, like you can actually see the Quickie Mart is over there, and little police cars in the police station and stuff like that. And I try not to, when I'm working on these things, I try really not to do a lot of extraneous, just goofy stuff. I try to make everything actually have a reason for being there. Like I really wanted police cars in the game, so like let's make a note of that. Kind of shows where every character is. And then these call-outs over here where we can go and we can look at each of these things. And because we're working with a vector-based program, I can really have tons of information. You can kind of zoom all the way down into the scratch-off ticket and learn about the scratch-off mini-game that's in there. And this is all on one piece of paper. And when you actually look at it on the table, this stuff is all very legible. I know on the screen it's making it look like, well, who would want to squint and look at that? It's actually pretty big and pretty easy to see. Again, printing on paper makes a big difference. Okay, so some examples of things I've worked on. Say you want to make one of these on your own. So here's the template that I would recommend you start with. Go through all these things because they're all important. So you want a title. Like, why are you even making this thing? And that's your title. And if you can't even fill in the title, then you probably should stop right there. So make sure that you really know what you're trying to accomplish by making this design document in the first place. Otherwise, the battle's already lost. And then date it. This is another thing. You're going to be printing these things out, and so your only type of way of knowing whether or not something's up to date is to look at that date. And you just have to be very disciplined about, like, every time you print that out, make sure the date's up to date. Or I've discovered, and this is why I'm warning you about it, is that it'll come back later and you're like, which one's the most recent? I can't remember. Lots of white space. When you make a one-page design document, what you don't want to do is take that design Bible, that first intro page, and just blow it up on a poster and hang it up on the wall. It's like, there you go, there's my one-page design document. I printed out tons of text on the wall. It's not going to help anybody. So, use lots of white space. A main illustration in the middle is always a good kind of graphic technique to draw people into it, and then do call-outs all around it and notes and bullet points and things like that. So again, I've been mentioning Adobe Illustrator. People, it's like, how do you do all this stuff? Almost everything you see in this presentation was done in Adobe Illustrator. And I can't say enough about like using Adobe Illustrator. If you're trying to do this in Photoshop, then just go home right now, because Photoshop is just this nasty thing for trying to do documents like this. You have to be very agile. You have to be able to like rotate and scale and move elements around, and Photoshop is just terrible at doing that. Plus, when you go print it on the giant plotter, you still have your like terrible DPI, or you've done the whole document in high resolution, and then it takes forever to load, and you're using up like 80 megabytes to do this. That whole Springfield document, I think, was like 2 megabytes. Because of the vector compression, and it just prints beautifully when you finally get around to printing these, because it's a printer resolution, not Illustrator resolution. So here's an example of kind of using that idea. There's a big drawing in the middle. Creature Traits is the title. This was from a kind of a pet training game that I worked on. And I won't go through what the design really means here, but the idea was that you start as a child, and then they could, depending on whether you hit them a lot when they were a kid or whether you nurtured them, they would have different personalities. So if you kind of throw them around and you wrestle with them, they'll become very physical. And so the main 3 things were physical, playful, and creative, and then there was kind of blends that you could mix. So this kind of shows a lot of information. It's in a very, one page, easy to kind of digest, and then you can kind of just explore it. If you're really compelled by it as you walk past it and you see it on a wall, you can stop and you can look at the high-level stuff, which is the most important, or you can start digging down into the little tiny details. This is another one from the same game, flowchart. This is another thing to do if you're working on a one-page design document. I recommend trying to do a flowchart first if you haven't done many of these. All games have some kind of engine in them that loops around forever until you die or you quit. And this game had a very simple flow to it that the player chooses an action. They're either like shaking the guy or treating the guy. That gets fed back in, and then the creature decides to do things based on its needs and moods and its training, and it just makes a simple loop. So this is a very simple document and just describes the main flow of the game, but it's pretty important because it's like the key element of like what can the player really do in this game, and what's the feedback coming back from the system so that the player knows what to do next. And that's really central to this project, so it was deserving of its own little document. Here's what not to do. I just typed in bad flowchart into Google Images just to see what would come up to show you what not to do. And this one came up, and it's actually something about the health bill. So I was like first looking at it, I'm like, man, whoever did this was like the worst graphic artist ever. It has so many obvious mistakes that this guy's a complete idiot and should be fired. And then I'm like looking at it, it's like it's so bad that it's purposely bad. It was done by Republicans to like obscure the issue, I think. So now I think the guy's a genius for like actually like setting that up. And you can use this own technique in your work, I think, if some other rival designer has a design that you disagree with, portray it this way. And so obviously mine's better. Mine's clean. Look at his. Another thing that you can do is to use storyboards. And this isn't the storyboard in the typical what you might think of as, like you're going to do your 30-second video in between levels or whatever. This one is really showing the entire game as a storyboard. I don't know if you can see the text there, but there's little timing marks, just like in the Diablo illustration, that's showing where we expect the player to be at certain times in the experience, and it goes all the way up through the whole game cycle as you move through the different phases of the creature's life cycle. And this one's pretty good. Like it shows you all the different key moments that the player is going to experience. It doesn't go into a lot of detail, but this is a great thing to give to marketing or to an executive where you just like, okay, here's what we're building, here's these moments, and then you can flesh out any one of these moments as needed. This one is from Spore, and this kind of shows, this was inspired by that Napoleon diagram that I showed you earlier. It's like, oh, in Spore we have these creatures and they march across these islands, so I'm going to use that same technique of showing space and time. And along the bottom there is the brain level. It shows you how powerful your creature should be and the estimated time and how the game flows across the continent as you play it. And as you move across the continent, the challenge starts to escalate up because we didn't want the player to just sit on the beach when they come up out of the water in Spore and just sit there the entire time and become this like huge Tyrannosaurus Rex stomping on little jellyfish and stuff in the beginning. We wanted to like incentivize you to move across, but we also wanted to know like how long should that take. And so I think it's really important when you're working on a lot of these diagrams is like really think about that time element and get that in there somehow, like, because it's a really common question. You don't want to wait till after development is all done and say, like, well, let's find out, hey, can you play our game and see how long it takes to get through? Like, you would rather, as a designer, say, we want our game to take 1 hour, and then we can make our content and everything match our intended design goals instead of finding out after the fact. This is another one that's from a robot game that I was working on, and the same kind of idea where it's got this like central illustration in the middle to kind of focus the attention. So when you walk by, it's like, whoa, what's that? I'm going to stop and see what that thing is, and little like the hypno wheel or the hypno toad or something in the middle to try to get people to walk over to your drawing. And then once they're there, okay, no, you can't leave. Now start reading because I want you to understand the game that you're working on. And then you can just start digging in, and there's just like these layers of information start to reveal themselves. So, on the one hand, it could be like, oh, it might take you a week of walking back and forth across this hallway before you've read this whole thing. But I can also, but that's better than not reading at all. And a lot of design documentation is really geared for a certain audience, like, oh, this is just for a programmer, or this is just for marketing. So it's kind of nice to be able to, have the whole team know what's going on across all the different departments. And this is a good way to kind of get everybody involved in the process without calling a meeting and having to sit down and talk to them. But if you do call a meeting and you bring this in, it's even better because now everybody has a common focus. When I start talking about some idea, it's not just this abstract and everybody's imagining something different. I'm guaranteed that everybody's imagining the same thing that's in front of them because that's what I put on the paper for them to put into their brains. So a lot of different information in these diagrams, covers the whole flow of the game. Now, what I'm trying to do in just kind of personal development, I guess, is like find the holy grail of one-page design documents. Is can I fit an entire game design for the entire game in one page? It's kind of, it's probably really hard to do, but it doesn't stop me from trying. So I just keep like pushing on the edges until, like I said, until I make these things explode. You can also use it to talk about like relationships between units. And actually, real quick on this one, relationships between the modules. Because this is such a high-level thing, it shows you how all the different areas interact with each other and how I can get from one module to the next. This one here is like, now within that game, let's talk about relationships between units. How do they all relate to each other? And because they're, instead of a wiki page just for the brutes and a wiki page just for the Futurians, I can actually kind of start to see their relationships between each other in this one document. So we started out when I was working on this one. This was the classic rock, paper, scissors kind of design technique. If you were at my talk last year, I kind of railed about that a little bit, but I use it all the time anyway because it's so easy. And so it's like, okay, we'll have 3 robot factions, and they'll just be like rock, paper, scissors, and brutes beat aliens, and aliens beat Futurians, and Futurians beat brutes. And we have kind of the archetype of each robot from movies and comic books and stuff, the steampunk and little insect bots and stuff. And then people are like, well, what about Mech Warrior? Where does that fit? Or what about those ones from the Matrix movies? Where do they fit in? And I realized it's like, this is a really constraining design space. It really only gives the player one of 3 choices. When they decide to pick what faction they want to be, there's very little room to maneuver. So just looking at the diagram, it occurred to me, it's like, oh, the diagram's drawn wrong. It would be much more powerful and much more design flexibility for the player is if it was shaped like this instead. So just a quick comparison. This is where everything's in the corner in rock, paper, scissors. And this I set them up along the sides. So now each race, the Futurians are actually a slider. And the player can control that slider by what parts they want to put on the robot. So you can slide it all the way over to high damage, or you can slide it all the way over to fast. And then you get Eve from Wall-E. And so that gives the player like these whole tunable ranges. Instead of me as a designer saying you either have to be rock, papers, or scissors, you'd be like, I'm going to be mostly scissors with just a little bit of rock. And that's going to beat this other guy who's doing some other strategy. And so we were able to get more robots put into it, but also just make a much better design. Another common thing that you can do is make a matrix design. And I love doing these. I do them all the time because it's such a great way to sort out design information. So what you do, instead of solving the problem from the bottom up, you just make your matrix and you solve it from the top down. So first of all, make your matrix. You can use Excel for this. You don't need Illustrator. Pick your attributes first, and here's just the classic example of water, nature, metal, fire, and some common character classes. And now that I have that done, 90% of the design is like, I've organized what I'm going to be talking about. The rest is just kind of the detail work. But if you start from the bottom up, then you kind of get lost. You're like, where am I? Where does this go? What's going on? So if I fill this whole chart out, and I just did this really quick just before the talk just to give this example, but it was kind of like as I started putting it together, it was kind of fun filling this grid in. I wanted 2 things per each class and 3 things for each faction. And when I started filling it in, I knew which squares I needed to fill in. And it just kind of started building itself, and it was kind of like a crossword puzzle for game designers maybe. You can take this challenge if you want. Just make these grids and try to fill them in and see what you can come up with. So, it's kind of a made-up example, but here's a real-world example. This is from the Cell game. That's a lead designer of the Cell game on Spore. And here, this is just really a matrix. You look at it and you're like, oh, awesome placemat. But, well, at least I look at it and say that. But it's really just this matrix. It's got the different levels, the 5 levels that you can go through in Cell game. And then the cells are sorted from the weakest, the things that you're going to eat, up to the most powerful, like the epics that will just stomp you in one bite. And there's also other information in there about what parts they drop and other little details like that. But I started out with the whole grid and just filled it in. Really easy to set that up once you have that going for you. Taking it kind of a step further, it's like one of the programmers who was working on it, Jeff Gates, he was kind of doing a bottom-up programming of the interactions between the different cells. So when a cell with a spike hits a cell with poison, who wins? And he was just like, oh, I need to answer that question, so I'll just write a little bit in there. But it was causing problems because it wasn't really hard. It was hard to know what had been designed in all these cases. So I went back and I did a top-down design where I said, here's every possibility, and then I went through, filled in all the stuff. Then you know that you're really thorough. You know that you've covered all the bases, and then you hand this off to the programmer, and he can go through and do a checklist to make sure that everything's covered. It starts to break down, though, unfortunately, if you get these really terrible Excel sheets with more than 2 dimensions. This one here had 4 dimensions, and what it's talking about is there's a consequence system in Spore, which is as you play through the game, things that you do as a cell and as a creature and in Civ and our tribe in Civ affect what you're going to be like when you get into space. And a lot of players don't realize this because a lot of players I talk to never get to space. But a lot of players, they only do it once. And so they're just like, oh, I got to space, and this is what happens. But really, if you play it a couple times, you realize when you get to space, completely different things are happening depending on how you played those previous games. And it turns out, because there's 4 different levels to play, and there's 3 different ways of playing each one, there's actually 4. You can skip it, which is one of the ways, but you can play aggressively, which is kind of the mean way. You can play nice, which is, you sing to people and you dance with them. Or you can be neutral, which is your half and half. So when you take all of that stuff together, there's 256 different ways to play Spore, which lead into what space is going to be like when you're all done. So I was trying to top down this problem, and it was just a nightmare. I'm looking at each one of these boxes. I can barely keep this document in my head. It's this 4-dimensional space thing that you're trying to juggle. It's just a nightmare. So I knew that it just wasn't working. And sometimes when you start working on these one-page designs, you know your design is bad because you can't make it into a one-page design. It just doesn't work right. And that usually means it's too complex. You're just thinking about the problem wrong. So let me see how I'm doing on time here. So I'm going to walk through kind of a step-by-step and show you the process that I used to come up with this chart. So there's a little bit of esoteric stuff here. But if you can just follow through, and if you get bored along the way, just look at the pictures and pretend it's Hypnotoad is talking to you. So here's my first take on that Excel sheet. So, what's really going on? Well, when I start at cell in the middle there, if I'm aggressive, I'm going to say aggressive is the red-colored dot. If I play cell aggressively, I move up towards the top of the screen. And then if I play creature aggressively, I keep moving up towards the top of the screen. And then if I play Civ and all the way, I end up getting a colored dot at the very top there, which happens to be warrior. So this chart clearly shows that if you do everything aggressively, you're going to become a warrior. Not too clear, but I love this chart when I put it together because it just looks so I don't know, from the 60s, like a dream catcher or something like that. So, this design's beautiful. It's elegant. Look at it. I could put it on a necklace and wear it. That's how cool this design is. But it was wrong. It was wrong in a lot of ways. And it took me a while of staring at it before I realized. So first of all, it's what are all these colors around the outside? It seems almost completely random what's going on there. And I realized it's the diagram was wrong. If you think of, say, a Japanese fan, you know how you can fold the Japanese fans. I had folded the fan all the way around to make it look like if you go to the very bottom, plain completely blue along the left side are playing completely green along the bottom right side, those things appear to be next to each other, when actually they're not next to each other at all. So the circle is just a bad metaphor, even though it makes a nice necklace. So if you think of the fan metaphor, again, like I folded the fan half up, I split it and said, like, the warrior should be 180 opposite from the shaman. And now it's like, okay, it's not as cool as that first Dreamcatcher diagram, but it's more true to what's really going on. So now I'm done with this document and everything looks cool. I'll print it, hang it on the wall. But it still completely bothered me because of that spectrum of colors running across the top. There was just no order to it at all. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. There's kind of more red stuff on the left side and more green stuff on the right. But every now and then you see a green on this side and a red on this side. And it's like, this shouldn't be, this isn't how it should be if it was done elegantly and correctly. So it took me a while of kind of goofing around with this diagram, more time than I probably should have spent goofing around with it, but I started to get possessed by it. So I kind of went back and thought about it of a different way. And what I really realized, I'm going to skip over what really happened, but eventually there's a vector math solution to the problem, which is that every time you do something red, you get a vector that moves you up. And every time you do something blue, you get a vector that moves you down to the left. And every time you get a vector that's green, that you're doing something nice, then you go this other way. And when you start combining those vectors up, instead of thinking of all 256 things, it actually breaks down to there's only like 36 different things that can possibly happen. And when I made that revelation, I was like, oh, now I can make this one-page design document. I'm going to give it to the programmers who have been just hating me because I keep giving them these Excel sheets to import into the program. And I'm going to clear this up once and for all. We finally solved this thing. And so I wrote up the document, sent it out. And again, this is a one-page design, 8.5 by 11. It wasn't a giant poster or anything. And I just printed it out and I gave it to the programmer and a couple other people and said, here's how the system should work. This is very clean. It's very elegant. And plus we can use an algorithm to solve the problem. We don't need this huge table that somebody hand-typed every little thing into cells. And an Excel spreadsheet, you can just run this formula. If they do something evil, move this way. If they do something nice, move this way. So at that point, I was like, well, okay, I'm done. I should really move on now. But again, there's something I want to see what this space looks like. Now that I know that it's this finite space, I want to plot it out and I want to discover what the true shape of this problem really was. So I kind of doodled in Illustrator. I made all the different possibilities. These are all the vectors that could possibly occur in Spore and how you move around into the different space. And it's this kind of abstract, what you're looking at here. But I drew them all out not knowing what was going to happen. And oh, that's kind of cool. It's it's an interesting kind of circuit electronic diagram or something. But what if I take their origins and I push all their origins together so that everything's coming off zero? So it's taking all these different vectors you see and kind of shoving them in that middle spot. What would happen? And I didn't know. And I put it all together and it's this came out of it. I'm wow, that's really cool. What did I discover? Some weird DNA thing that was existing inside this spreadsheet the whole time. And so now when I finally saw this, it was really clear. I decorated it up a little bit and printed out a new document. And this became the poster child for this project, for this section of the project with the consequences. And it really, to me, it just clearly showed what was going on in the game in a really nice, easy to understand way. Now, again, I don't expect you to completely understand it because you weren't working on the program with us for weeks trying to sort this all out. But for those of us kind of in the trenches for a while, it was really almost like a breath of fresh air. And a lot of people were oh, can I have that diagram? I want to hang it up on my wall, even though they weren't working on it, because it just kind of looks like fun, it's a bunch of Skittles or M&Ms. You could just eat it, All right, so I'll kind of end on that one. Just kind of summarize here. Let's see, how am I doing on time? Okay, right on time. So a lot of benefits for writing these documents, one-page documents. The first are for your team. So like I was saying before, if you make a design document and you give it to one person on your team, well, shouldn't everybody on the team kind of know about that? And usually the answer is no, because no one wants to be bothered. But if you make these really nice, clean one-page design documents, then it's just the opposite. People want to be drawn in. They ask you for the document instead of you having to go out to them. One thing that you need to know, though, is that when you make these designs, you personally need to print them out and hand them to people. Don't put them in a file and email them the file. Don't put it up on the wiki and say, here's the link to the thing you should click and download and print yourself, because they won't. If you really want people to see your designs, like, get out of your chair at least a couple times a day, walk to the printer, and then walk to the people and hand this stuff out. And that's the only way you can really guarantee that they're going to see your designs. And I really recommend face-to-face contact. During meetings, when you're going with these things, bring in pencils with you. It's amazing to me, like, a lot of people don't bring pencils to meetings anymore. They bring their laptops to meetings. And to me, it's really sad. Like, you don't have a pen with you? Like, how do you exist? I've got this. Who needs a pen? But I can carry around this thing that runs out of batteries that I've got to plug in everywhere I go. Why would I want this little thing that fits in my pocket? So anyway, bring them with you so that you don't have to berate them for not bringing their own. And give them each a copy and actually encourage them to write on these things. They're not, you're not going to hang them up in a museum. They're meant to be working documents, and you want people to engage with them. You want their comments, and then you can take that back and make the next iteration. Here's an example. Like, so this is, fresh off the press from Adobe Illustrator diagram that I gave to one of our level designers when I was working on Galactic Adventures. We had like 64 of these little missions, and so there's a page for each one of them. And so I gave him this one, and a couple days later I walked by his desk, and this is what it looked like. This is the scan of that same thing a few days later. And this is what you want to happen. This is what, then you know they're really reading the stuff. They're actively engaged in the process, and they're giving you this feedback that then you can incorporate in the next generation. A lot of benefits for you too, not just for your team. Even if your team never reads any of these things, it really forces you as a designer to do some work in your head. Like, don't just throw out a bunch of garbage and say, give me my paycheck. You actually have to really understand the problem. Otherwise, you'll never be able to make one of these diagrams to begin with. It also forces concise design, because what happens is you start to work on these things and it starts sprawling, and the paper gets big, and you're just trying to cram stuff and you're shrinking stuff down and it just doesn't fit. Like, well, is that really important? What is the most important thing that I really need to communicate in this document that I'm making right now? Let me, I've got to decide tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, and once I get below, say, 4-point font, then, just forget it. You can only go so far. It also, like I talked about, it highlights the relationships in the system, so it lets you, as a designer, as you start putting these things together and drawing arrows and connecting the lines, you're like, oh, that has that effect on this other thing. Oh, I see it now. Where, like I mentioned, the wiki is notorious for chopping up your design and breaking connections between things other than a hyperlink, which is not really a real connection in my mind. And totally aids problem solving is the example, the long example that I gave there at the end. So just to summarize here, and then let's see how we're doing. Yeah, we'll have a few minutes for questions. So the goal here of any design, of the designer and their design that they make, is to communicate an idea. Your job as a designer is to kind of come up with solutions to problems, figure out what's going on, and then getting that information back out to the team. And that's what you need to do. And these documents are just a great way of doing that. Yeah, is it hard? Oh yeah, it's really hard to make some of these things. It can take a long time, but like I said, what are you getting paid for? You got to do hard stuff. Everything can't be easy all the time. They tricked me, because when I first went into game design, it was like I thought I just got to sit around and play video games all day, and then I found out, no, you actually have to work. They didn't tell me that in the commercials. And people will read your designs very obviously. And I hope just some of you in the audience, as you looked at some of these things, like, man, I wish I could see that design. I want to see more of that. And if you had that reaction, then it was a complete success, because that's the reaction that I'm going for, to draw people into your stuff instead of you having to call a meeting and tell everybody what's going on. Okay, so that about wraps it up. And thank you. I'll post these slides up on my website, stonetronix.com, and it'll be in a week or two. But if you're interested in getting a copy of those, then they'll be up there. All right, so it looks like we have maybe about 10 minutes or so for questions, if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
So I was wondering, could you talk a little bit more about the frequency with which you would update these, and did you do anything special to call attention to, hey, here's what changed from last time, visually?
Yeah, I usually, so it depends. It goes all over the board, right? A lot of times what's going to happen is that I'll print out a really rough version, and of course I'm only showing you mostly the coolest stuff, right? I'm not showing you a lot of the stuff that leads up to that. But a lot of times we'll have very just early meetings, and it's really helpful no matter what level you're at, is just to go in with the current understanding, even if it's just black and white and really simple. You don't do all the fancy stuff right away. And then based on that meeting, you decide, like, did people get the idea? Does it need more work? Did I miss a big section everybody was confused about? So I don't have a good answer to that, but some of them I update. That's all I do for a week. Like, my job for this week is to get this diagram done. And that's basically all I'm doing, is like updating it, having meetings, showing it to people until it's ready to put up on the wall. And usually once it goes up on the wall, at that point I'm usually pretty confident that this is like the final design. Now, there may be one or two changes, but at that point most of those changes are pretty subtle. And if it is big enough, then I'll let people know about it.
Yeah, and it seems like you'll go down this route for certain problems that you need to communicate out to people. Like, do you ever try to do sort of an all-encompassing, here's the suite of one-page game designs that encompasses the whole project?
Well, like I said, that's the holy grail of this, and that's what I'm trying to do in my mind, like eventually like kind of stretch this limit. Like, how far can I go with this? I don't even know. I've been kind of goofing around with it for 10 years, and I pushed it pretty far. But I'm still, like, every time I work on one of these, I kind of challenge myself to, like, what can I do differently that I haven't done before? How can I push this a little further?
Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Hey, Stone, good talk.
Hey,
A couple questions. So in traditional Bible-driven design, if you want to call it that, it's like you spend a lot of time understanding the design yourself, documenting the design, and then you spend this huge amount of time on a project updating design, which is like really horrible, as opposed to communicating with people. In this method, it seems like what you're doing is you're getting this comprehensive picture of the design, and then you're compressing it. And then you spend a lot of your time communicating with people to help them correctly unpack the thing that you've compressed.
Yeah, I think it is much of a higher level thing, and that's what I'm saying. When you have to decide what you want to put in the document.
Right.
And so there's kind of this subtractive art going on there. Instead of being, you put it pretty well. It's like, instead of being all-inclusive, you're trying to, like, really call out the most important things.
Right. So I have two questions about that. As a percentage of your time, even though I acknowledge that your time is better spent communicating with people and helping them unpack those ideas, as a percentage of your time, how much time do you think you spend doing that versus coming up with the design and coming up with the document? That's question one. And question two, what kind of errors do you see your coworkers making